When the sheriff walked into the saloon, the merciless August sun had been beating down on Dust Valley since dawn, turning the weathered wooden buildings into ovens and the dusty main street into a shimmering mirage of heat waves. By 6 o'clock in the evening, the temperature still hovered near unbearable, and even the hardy folks who called this frontier town home were feeling the oppressive weight of another scorching summer day. The Golden Spurs Saloon stood at the heart of Dust Valley like a beacon of refuge, its bat-winged doors constantly swinging as cowboys, ranchers, drifters and townspeople sought shelter from the relentless heat. The establishment had earned its reputation as the liveliest spot between El Paso and Santa Fe, a place where whiskey flowed like water, card games lasted until dawn, and men settled their differences with fists, bullets, or both. Inside the saloon, the atmosphere was thick, with more than just tobacco smoke and the pungent smell of cheap whiskey. The air itself seemed to crackle with tension, as if lightning were about to strike in a cloudless sky. Overhead, the wooden ceiling fans turned lazily, stirring the heavy air but providing little relief from the suffocating heat that had everyone's tempers running shorter than a hangman's rope. Behind the mahogany bar that had been hauled all the way from St. Louis, Salvatore Big Sal Martinez wiped down glasses with mechanical precision. The portly barkeeper had seen more fights than a prize ring referee in his 15 years running the Golden Spurs, and his experienced eye could read trouble in a man's posture long before the first punch was thrown. Tonight, he could feel it, building like storm clouds on the horizon. At the far end of the bar, hunched over his fourth whiskey of the evening, sat Billy "Snake" Carter. The notorious gunslinger cut an intimidating figure even when relaxed. His black Stetson pulled low over dark eyes that missed nothing, a carefully waxed mustache that gave his weathered face a perpetual sneer, and twin Colt .45 peacemakers that hung from his gun belt like sleeping serpents ready to strike. Snake's reputation had been carved in blood across 3 territories, and the stories of his lightning-fast draw and deadly accuracy had grown with each telling around countless campfires. Snake had ridden into Dust Valley 3 days earlier with his usual crew, a collection of hard-faced men who rode the Owl Hoot Trail and lived by the gun. They'd taken rooms at the Frontier Hotel, paid their bills in silver dollars, and spent their evenings in the Golden Spurs, drinking steadily and eyeing the locals with the predatory gaze of wolves sizing up a flock of sheep. "Another whiskey," Snake muttered to Big Sal, sliding his empty glass across the scarred wooden surface. His voice carried the gravelly rasp of a man who'd spent too many nights around campfires and too many days breathing desert dust. Sal poured the amber liquid, without comment, but his thick fingers lingered near the sawed-off shotgun mounted beneath the bar. He'd learned long ago that men like Snake Carter brought trouble the way storm clouds brought rain. It was just a matter of when, not if. At a corner table near the window, Tommy Jenkins nursed his second beer of the night with the careful deliberation of a young man trying to keep his anger in check. The 23-year-old rancher had the lean build and calloused hands of someone who'd spent his life working cattle under the unforgiving southwestern sun. His sun-bleached hair stuck out from under a well-worn hat, and his blue eyes held the kind of intensity that spoke of sleepless nights and growing desperation. Tommy had inherited the Circle J ranch from his father 2 years earlier, along with a mortgage that seemed to grow larger every month, and a herd of cattle that represented his only hope of keeping the family homestead. But for the past 6 weeks, that herd had been steadily diminishing. First, it was just a few head here and there, losses that could be attributed to wolves, disease, or simple straying. But as the numbers grew, a more sinister pattern emerged. The young rancher's jaw clenched as he replayed the conversation he'd had with old Miguel Esperanza earlier that day. The weathered Mexican vaquero who worked the neighboring spread had pulled Tommy aside at the general store, his ancient eyes filled with worry and his voice barely above a whisper. "Senor Tommy," Miguel had said, glancing around nervously. "I see things, bad things, men riding at night near your pastures, men with faces I recognize from wanted posters in the sheriff's office." When Tommy pressed for details, Miguel had reluctantly described seeing Snake Carter's gang moving cattle under cover of darkness, driving them toward the Badlands where rustled livestock could be rebranded and sold to unscrupulous buyers who asked no questions about previous ownership. Now, sitting in the same saloon as the man he believed was stealing his livelihood, Tommy felt his anger building like pressure in a steam boiler. Every sip of beer tasted bitter. Every minute that passed felt like another nail in the coffin of his dreams. And every glance toward Snake Carter made his right hand twitch closer to the Colt 44 on his hip. The saloon's other patrons seemed to sense the underlying tension without understanding its source. Conversations were more subdued than usual. Card games proceeded with unusual caution, and even the working girls, who usually circulated freely among the customers, kept to themselves near the back of the room. At the upright piano in the far corner, Pete Morrison pecked out a melancholy version of Red River Valley, with fingers that had grown arthritic from 40 years of coaxing music from saloon pianos across the frontier. The 70-year-old musician had lost his left eye to a broken bottle in Abilene and his right leg to a Comanche arrow near Fort Worth, but his weathered hands could still make the piano sing with a beauty that brought tears to the eyes of cowboys who hadn't seen their mothers in years. Tonight, however, Pete's usual repertoire of cheerful dance tunes and sentimental ballads felt wrong somehow. The music seemed to hang in the heavy air like smoke from a funeral pyre, and more than once he found himself trailing off mid-song, uncertain whether anyone was really listening. Near the poker table, a group of cowhands from the Lazy Bee Ranch were engaged in their weekly game, but their usual banter had been replaced by nervous glances and whispered conversations. Jake Morrison, Pete's nephew, and the Lazy Bee's top hand kept shooting worried looks toward both Snake Carter and Tommy Jenkins, his weathered face creased with concern. "Something's gonna blow tonight," Jake muttered to his partner, Cookie Williams, as he studied his cards without really seeing them. "You can feel it in the air like electricity before a twister." Cookie, a grizzled veteran of countless cattle drives and barroom brawls, nodded grimly. "That young Jenkins boy's been staring holes through Snake Carter for the better part of an hour, and Snake ain't the type to ignore that kind of disrespect for long." At the bar, two traveling salesmen from Kansas City tried to maintain a conversation about the weather and the price of beef, but their voices carried the strained quality of men who were acutely aware they might be in the wrong place at the wrong time. One kept glancing toward the door as if calculating the distance he'd need to cover to reach safety, while the other fingered a small derringer in his vest pocket with sweaty palms. As the evening wore on and the whiskey flowed more freely, the atmosphere in the Golden Spurs grew increasingly volatile. Snake Carter's crew had gradually positioned themselves around the room, not obviously, but with the practiced ease of men who'd learned to watch each other's backs in hostile territory. Mexican Joe Morales leaned against the wall near the stairs, his hand resting casually on his gun butt. Dynamite Dan Sullivan occupied a chair that gave him clear lines of fire toward both the front door and the bar. Frank, the Knife, Kennedy, had taken a position near the back entrance, ostensibly playing solitaire but actually keeping watch for potential threats. Tommy Jenkins was oblivious to the tactical positioning taking place around him. His attention remained fixed on Snake Carter with the intensity of a man staring at his own execution. The beer in his hand had grown warm and flat, forgotten as his mind churned with images of his dwindling cattle herd and his father's disappointed ghost. The breaking point came at 9:30, just as Pete Morrison was launching into, "Oh!" Susanna, for the third time that evening, Snake Carter, emboldened by whiskey and annoyed by the persistent weight of Tommy's stare, finally turned on his bar stool to face the young rancher directly. "You got something you want to say to me, boy?" Snake's voice cut through the ambient noise like a knife through silk. The question wasn't really a question. It was a challenge, delivered with the cold confidence of a man who'd killed 17 men in fair fights and twice that number in situations that weren't quite so fair. The saloon went dead quiet. Pete's piano fell silent mid-note. Poker chips stopped clinking, glasses stopped being raised to lips, and even the grandfather clock in the corner seemed to tick more softly. Every eye in the room turned toward the two men who were about to determine whether the evening would end with handshakes or gunshots. Tommy straightened in his chair, his young face flushing red beneath the brim of his hat. For a moment that stretched like eternity, he considered backing down, apologizing, maybe even buying Snake a drink and pretending nothing had happened. But then he thought about his father's ranch, about the cattle that represented his only hope for the future, and about the stories old Miguel had whispered in the general store that afternoon. "Matter of fact, I do," Tommy replied, his voice steadier than he'd expected. "You and your boys have been seen near my spread. Funny how my cattle started disappearing right around the same time you rode into town." A collective intake of breath rippled through the saloon. Accusations of cattle rustling were fighting words in cattle country, the kind of charge that traditionally ended with hemp neckties and shallow graves. Snake's dark eyes narrowed to slits, and his right hand moved almost imperceptibly closer to his gun. "That's a mighty serious accusation, Jenkins," Snake said, his voice dropping to a whisper that somehow carried to every corner of the room. "You got any proof to back up that flapping tongue of yours, or are you just looking to get yourself killed on this fine summer evening?" Tommy's heart hammered against his ribs like a caged bird, but he'd committed himself now. "Don't need proof. To know a snake when I see one, Carter. Your reputation speaks for itself. Cattle rustling, bank robbing, murder. You're nothing but a common thief with fancy guns." The insult hung in the air like smoke from a discharged pistol. Snake's face darkened with rage, and his crew began to shift position slightly, preparing for whatever might come next. Around the room, other patrons started edging toward walls and doorways, seeking cover from the gunfight that seemed inevitable. "Boy," Snake said, rising slowly from his bar stool with the deliberate grace of a rattlesnake preparing to strike. "You just made the last mistake of your short, stupid life." Tommy pushed back from his table and stood to face his accuser, his hand moving to hover over his gun butt. "Maybe it's time someone stood up to you, Carter. This town's been living in fear of you and your gang long enough." That's when Mexican Joe made his move. The swarthy outlaw had been waiting for exactly this moment, and as Tommy's attention focused entirely on Snake, Joe saw his chance. He pushed away from the wall where he'd been lounging and reached for his gun, intending to end the confrontation before it really began by putting a bullet in the young rancher's back. But Jake Morrison, the cowhand from the Lazy Bee, had been watching Joe as carefully as everyone else had been watching Snake and Tommy. The moment he saw the outlaw's hand move toward his weapon, Jake shouted a warning. "Look out, Tommy! Behind you!" Tommy spun toward the new threat, his own gun clearing. Leather in a motion that was fast, but not nearly fast enough. Joe's pistol was already coming up, the barrel swinging toward Tommy's chest, when Cookie Williams launched himself across the intervening space and tackled the outlaw around the waist. The two men went down in a tangle of arms and legs, Joe's gun discharging harmlessly into the ceiling and sending a shower of plaster dust down on the struggling combatants. The unexpected gunshot was like a match thrown into a powder keg. Suddenly everyone in the saloon was moving at once. Snake Carter drew both his Colts with the lightning speed that had made him famous across the frontier, but instead of shooting Tommy, he found himself facing Jake Morrison, who had pulled his own weapon and was drawing down on Dynamite Dan Sullivan. Dan, meanwhile, was trying to get a clear shot at Tommy while avoiding the wild swings of a chair-wielding cowboy who'd been sitting at the next table. In the space of 3 seconds, the Golden Spurs Saloon exploded into absolute chaos. Men who'd been quietly nursing their drinks suddenly found themselves in a life-or-death struggle as alliances formed and dissolved in the heat of combat. The carefully maintained balance between outlaws and honest citizens collapsed like a house of cards in a windstorm. Tommy Jenkins discovered that starting a fight was considerably easier than controlling one. His accusation had lit the fuse, but now the explosion was far beyond anything he'd imagined. Instead of a simple confrontation between himself and Snake Carter, he was caught in the middle of a full-scale barroom war involving nearly every patron in the establishment. A bottle thrown by Frank Kennedy shattered against the wall inches from Tommy's head, spraying him with glass and whiskey. He ducked instinctively and found himself face to face with one of the traveling salesmen from Kansas City, who was crawling across the floor in a desperate attempt to reach the safety of the front door. The man's spectacles were cracked, his suit was torn, and his face was white with terror. "This is insane," the salesman screamed over the din of combat. "We're all going to die." Tommy might have agreed with that assessment, but he was too busy dodging a chair that came flying across the room courtesy of Mexican Joe, who had managed to extricate himself from his wrestling match with Cookie Williams. The chair splintered against a support beam, sending wooden fragments in all directions and adding to the general chaos. Snake Carter found himself in the unusual position of fighting multiple opponents simultaneously. His reputation had been built on face-to-face duels, where speed and accuracy were the determining factors, but barroom brawls followed different rules entirely. Raw strength, endurance, and pure luck often mattered more than skill with a gun. The notorious gunslinger had managed to pistol-whip one of the Lazy Bee cowhands and was now grappling with Big Sal, who had come around the bar, wielding his famous sawed-off shotgun like a club. The bartender might have been carrying extra weight around his middle, but 15 years of breaking up fights had given him muscles in places most men didn't know they had muscles. "You started this mess, Carter," Sal growled as he swung the heavy shotgun in a wide arc that Snake barely managed to duck. "Now you're gonna pay for my broken furniture." Snake tried to bring one of his Colts to bear, but Sal was too close and too aggressive. The bartender grabbed Snake's gun arm, and the two men went spinning across the floor, crashing into tables and scattering chairs like bowling pins. Meanwhile, Pete Morrison had abandoned his piano bench and joined the fray with enthusiasm that belied his 70 years. The one-eyed musician had grabbed a broken chair leg and was wielding it like a club, taking swings at anyone who came within reach, regardless of which side they were on. "This is for interrupting my music," Pete shouted, as he caught Dynamite Dan across the shoulders with his improvised weapon. "A man's got a right to play piano in peace." Dan staggered under the blow, but managed to grab Pete around the waist, and the two men went down in a heap, rolling across the sawdust-covered floor in a desperate struggle. Pete might have been old, but he was wiry and surprisingly strong, and his years of saloon fighting had taught him every dirty trick in the book. The poker game had completely disintegrated as the players abandoned their cards in favor of more pressing concerns, like avoiding broken bottles and flying furniture. Jake Morrison was trading punches with Frank Kennedy near the overturned poker table, while the pot of nearly $40 lay scattered across the floor, trampled by boots and forgotten in the heat of battle. One of the working girls, a red-headed woman named Stella, who'd seen more than her share of saloon fights, had taken refuge behind the bar and was methodically loading shells into Sal's spare shotgun. She'd learned long ago that in situations like this, it was better to be prepared for the worst than to hope for the best. "Come on, boys," she called out encouragingly. "Dance like your lives depend on it, because they probably do." The fight raged with unabated fury for what felt like hours, but was probably only 10 or 15 minutes. Men crashed through tables, rolled across the floor in desperate struggles, and used everything from broken bottles to piano keys as weapons. The air filled with curses in English, Spanish, and languages that might have been invented on the spot by men too angry and too drunk to remember proper grammar. Glass shattered continuously as bottles and mirrors became casualties of the ongoing war. The beautiful mahogany bar that had been Big Sal's pride and joy was now scarred with bullet holes and stained with spilled liquor and blood. Pete's precious piano, which had somehow managed to survive the first few minutes of combat, finally succumbed when Mexican Joe was thrown bodily across its keyboard, producing a discordant crash that sounded like a dying elephant. The smell of spilled alcohol, sweat, gun smoke, and blood created a cocktail of odors that would have been overwhelming under normal circumstances, but went largely unnoticed by men who were focused entirely on survival. Sawdust, originally spread on the floor to absorb spilled drinks, now served the grimmer purpose of soaking up blood from split lips, broken noses, and various cuts and scrapes. Tommy Jenkins, the young rancher whose accusation had started the whole mess, found himself fighting for his life against opponents who seemed to emerge from the chaos like demons from hell. He'd lost his hat in the first few seconds of the brawl, and his shirt was torn and bloody, but he was still on his feet and still swinging. A punch from Dynamite Dan had opened a cut above his left eye that bled freely, partially obscuring his vision, but adrenaline and desperation kept him moving. He'd traded his gun for a broken bottle after Mexican Joe had knocked the weapon from his hand with a well-thrown chair, and now he wielded the improvised weapon with the desperation of a man who knew he was fighting for his life. Snake Carter, meanwhile, was discovering that his reputation as the fastest gun in 3 territories didn't mean much when he was rolling around on a saloon floor, trying to avoid being strangled by an angry bartender. Big Sal had gotten both, hands around Snake's throat, and was squeezing with the determination of a man who'd had his life's work destroyed by unwelcome visitors. "You're choking me," Snake gasped, his face turning purple as Sal's massive hands tightened their grip. "That's the general idea, you sidewinding son of a rattlesnake," Sal replied through gritted teeth. "Should have thought about that before you started tearing up my saloon." Snake managed to get one knee up and drove it into Sal's substantial belly, breaking the bartender's grip and sending both men rolling apart. They came to their feet simultaneously, circling each other like angry bulls, each looking for an opening to end the fight permanently. The brawl had now reached the point where it seemed to have taken on a life of its own. Men who'd started fighting for specific reasons were now swinging at anyone within reach, driven by adrenaline, alcohol, and the simple momentum of violence. The original dispute between Tommy Jenkins and Snake Carter had been forgotten in the general melee, replaced by the more immediate concern of avoiding serious injury or death. Cookie Williams had somehow acquired a broken table leg and was using it to fend off attacks from multiple directions, spinning and swinging like a one-man tornado of destruction. Frank Kennedy had lost his gun somewhere in the chaos and was now fighting with his bare hands and a surprisingly effective technique that involved using his opponent's momentum against them. Even the 2 traveling salesmen from Kansas City had been drawn into the fight, though their involvement was more accidental than intentional. They'd been trying to crawl toward the front door when the battle had literally rolled over them, and now they found themselves defending against attacks from men who were too drunk and too angry to distinguish between friend and foe. Outside, the Golden Spurs, a crowd of curious onlookers had gathered on the wooden sidewalk, drawn by the sounds of combat, but smart enough to stay clear of the flying debris that occasionally burst through the saloon's front windows. The noise could be heard 3 blocks away, shouting, cursing, crashing furniture, breaking glass, and the occasional gunshot that sent the crowd ducking for cover. Mrs. Henderson, the banker's wife and unofficial moral guardian of Dust Valley, stood with her hands pressed to her face in horror as another chair came flying through the front window to crash on the street in front of her. "Someone should do something," she declared to anyone who would listen. "This is a civilized town. We can't have this kind of behavior." Doc Patterson, the town's physician and a man who'd patched up more gunshot wounds than he cared to remember, was already preparing his medical bag. "We're going to need every bandage in town before this is over," he muttered to his assistant, "and probably a few coffins too." The Reverend Samuel Morrison, Pete's younger brother and pastor of the First Methodist Church, wrung his hands helplessly as he contemplated the carnage taking place just 50 yards from his sanctuary. "Violence begets violence," he said sadly. "When will these men learn that their fists and guns can't solve every problem?" But for all their concern and commentary, none of the onlookers seemed inclined to actually enter the saloon and attempt to restore order. The battle raging inside the Golden Spurs had reached a level of intensity that would have given pause to a company of cavalry, let alone a collection of shopkeepers and citizens who preferred their excitement in smaller, more manageable doses. Inside the saloon, the fight was beginning to take its toll on the combatants. Men who'd started the evening full of energy and righteous anger were now breathing hard, moving slower, and showing the accumulated damage of 15 minutes of intensive combat. Blood flowed freely from split lips, broken noses, and various cuts and scrapes. Clothing was torn, hats were lost, and more than one participant was beginning to question the wisdom of getting involved in what had started as someone else's dispute. Tommy Jenkins, his youthful energy beginning to flag, found himself backed against the wall near the overturned piano. Mexican Joe and Dynamite Dan had apparently decided that the young rancher was the root cause of all their troubles and were advancing on him with murder in their eyes. Tommy still clutched his broken bottle, but his arm was tired, and his vision was blurred by the blood flowing from the cut above his eye. "End of the line, boy," Mexican Joe snarled, producing a wicked-looking knife from his boot. "You should have kept your mouth shut and minded your own business." Tommy tried to summon the energy for one more desperate charge, but his legs felt like lead, and his breathing came in ragged gasps. He'd started the fight with righteous anger and the conviction that he was defending his family's legacy, but now he was simply trying to stay alive long enough to see another sunrise. That's when the saloon doors creaked open. The sound was soft, almost gentle, but it seemed to cut through the chaos like a church bell on Sunday morning. One by one, the combatants began to notice that something had changed. A presence had entered the room that commanded attention without saying a word, a force that seemed to draw the violence out of the air, like a lightning rod draws electricity from a storm cloud. John McCallister stood in the doorway, his tall frame silhouetted against the dim light from the oil lamps that lined Dust Valley's main street. The sheriff's weathered face was calm, almost serene, but his steel-grey eyes swept the room with the intensity of a man who'd seen every kind of trouble the frontier could offer and lived to tell about it. At 52, he carried himself with the quiet confidence of someone who'd earned his authority through years of facing down the worst kinds of men in the worst kinds of situations. His boots, worn but well-maintained leather that had walked thousands of miles across desert, mountain, and plain, clicked against the wooden floor as he took a single step into the saloon. Then another. The sound seemed impossibly loud in the sudden quiet that had begun to fall over the room like snow on a winter morning. McCallister's hat, a battered Stetson that had shielded him from sun, rain, and bullets for more than 2 decades, was pulled low over his brow, casting shadows that made his eyes appear even more penetrating than usual. The silver badge pinned to his black vest caught the lamplight and seemed to glow with an authority that transcended the simple piece of metal from which it was cut. Beneath his open coat, the worn grips of his Colt 45 were visible, but the weapon remained holstered. a sleeping giant that everyone in the room knew could awaken with lightning speed if circumstances required it. The sheriff didn't draw his gun, he didn't raise his voice, he didn't threaten anyone or demand immediate surrender. He simply stood there, his presence filling the room like water filling a basin, inevitable and complete. There was something about John McCallister that commanded respect without demanding it, that projected strength without displaying it, and that promised swift justice without threatening it. Snake Carter, who'd been in the process of throwing a punch at Big Sal's jaw, slowly lowered his fist and stepped back. His dark eyes, which had been blazing with anger and whiskey-fueled rage just moments before, now registered something that might have been caution or even respect. The notorious gunslinger had faced down sheriffs, marshals, and bounty hunters across half the American West. But there was something different about McCallister, something that made even a man like Snake think twice about reaching for his guns. Tommy Jenkins, who'd been preparing to make what might have been his final stand against Mexican Joe and Dynamite Dan, felt his grip on the broken bottle relax slightly. The young rancher's chest was still heaving from exertion, and his vision was still blurred by blood. But his attention was now completely focused on the man who just walked through the saloon doors like the answer to a prayer he'd been too proud to pray. One by one, the other combatants stopped fighting. Fists that had been flying moments before now hung at their owners' sides. Men who'd been rolling on the floor in desperate struggles slowly got to their feet, their eyes never leaving the sheriff. Even Pete Morrison, who'd been enthusiastically battering Dynamite Dan with his broken chair leg, lowered his improvised weapon and stepped back with something approaching embarrassment on his weathered face. McCallister took another step into the room, then another. His spurs jingled softly with each movement, the only sound in the suddenly silent saloon other than the labored breathing of men who'd been fighting for their lives just moments before. The sheriff surveyed the destruction with the same calm expression he might use to examine a horse he was considering purchasing. Interested, but not surprised, taking in the details without apparent judgment. Overturned tables, broken chairs, shattered bottles, blood-stained sawdust, and Pete's ruined piano told the story of the battle that had just ended as clearly as if it had been written in a book. Glass crunched under McCallister's boots as he moved deeper into the room, stepping carefully around unconscious men and scattered debris without ever taking his eyes off the remaining combatants. The sheriff paused in the center of the room, his gaze moving slowly from face to face, taking the measure of each man present with the practiced eye of someone who'd learned to read character in split seconds. When his eyes met Snake Carter's, the gunslinger found himself unable to maintain the contact and looked away, something that would have been unthinkable just minutes earlier. "Evening, gentlemen," McCallister said finally, his voice carrying easily through the room despite its conversational tone. There was no anger in it, no condemnation, just a simple acknowledgement of the men before him and the situation in which they found themselves. The silence that followed stretched like a taut rope, ready to snap at the slightest provocation. Nobody seemed willing to be the first to speak, to move, or even to breathe too loudly. The atmosphere in the Golden Spurs had been transformed in the space of a few seconds from one of barely contained violence to something approaching reverence. Sheriff. McCallister's reputation in Dust Valley and the surrounding territory was built on more than just his skill with a gun, though that skill was considerable. He was known as a man who kept his word, who treated everyone fairly regardless of their station in life, and who could be counted on to do the right thing even when it wasn't the easy thing. In a land where justice often came at the end of a rope or the barrel of a gun, McCallister represented something different, the possibility that law and order didn't have to be synonymous with brutality and revenge. The sheriff reached into his vest pocket and withdrew a small cloth, using it to wipe a spot of what might have been blood or whiskey from his badge. The simple gesture somehow managed to be more intimidating than any display of force might have been. A quiet reminder that he took his responsibilities seriously and expected others to do the same. "Now then," McCallister continued, replacing the cloth in his pocket with the same deliberate care he brought to everything he did. "I reckon most of you boys know me, and I know most of you. We've all got to live in this town together, breathe the same air, walk the same streets, do business with the same merchants. Seems to me that makes us neighbors, whether we particularly like each other or not." He paused, letting his words sink in while his eyes continued to move around the room, making brief contact with each man present. When his gaze fell on Tommy Jenkins, the young rancher straightened instinctively, something in the sheriff's steady presence demanding his best posture and attention. "Neighbors," McCallister repeated as if testing the word, "generally don't try to beat each other to death with furniture, least not the kind of neighbors I prefer to have in my town." Snake Carter found his voice first, though it came out rougher and less confident than usual. "Sheriff, this was just a misunderstanding that got out of hand, nothing that couldn't be settled with a few drinks and some friendly conversation." McCallister's gaze settled on the notorious gunslinger with the weight of a judge's gavel. So Snake, from where I'm standing, it looked more like a small war, but then I've seen my share of both wars and misunderstandings, and I generally know the difference." The sheriff began to walk slowly around the room, stepping carefully over debris and unconscious men while maintaining his unhurried pace. His movements were casual, almost leisurely, but every person in the saloon tracked his progress like prairie dogs watching a hawk circle overhead. "You know," McCallister said conversationally as he navigated around an overturned table, "I was having dinner with my wife when I heard the commotion. Nice quiet evening, pot roast and potatoes, discussing plans for Sunday service. Then all this noise starts up, glass breaking, men shouting, guns going off. Martha asked me if I was going to do something about it." He paused to examine Pete's ruined piano, running his fingers over the splintered wood and broken keys with something that might have been sadness. "I told her I'd probably have to, seeing as how keeping the peace is what the good people of this town pay me to do, but I was hoping it might settle itself before I had to interrupt my meal and walk down here in this heat." The sheriff's tone remained conversational, almost friendly, but there was an undercurrent of steel that no one in the room missed. This was a man who took his duties seriously, who didn't appreciate having his peaceful evening disrupted, and who was prepared to take whatever steps were necessary to restore order. "Tell me, Snake," McCallister said, using the gunslinger's nickname without any trace of mockery or familiarity, "what kind of misunderstanding requires this much broken furniture to resolve? Must have been quite a philosophical difference of opinion." Snake's jaw worked silently for a moment before he answered. "Young Jenkins here made some accusations about my business practices. Things got heated when other folks decided to stick their noses in where they didn't belong." McCallister nodded slowly, as if this explanation made perfect sense. "Accusations, you say? What kind of accusations might those have been, Tommy?" Tommy Jenkins swallowed hard, suddenly aware that he was about to make his case before the one man in Dust Valley whose opinion really mattered. "My cattle have been disappearing, Sheriff. Started about 6 weeks ago, just a few head at a time. Miguel Esperanza told me he'd seen Carter's gang moving livestock at night, driving them toward the Badlands." The sheriff listened without interruption, his expression giving nothing away. When Tommy finished speaking, McCallister turned back to Snake Carter with the same calm attention he'd given the young rancher. "Well now, Snake, that's quite an accusation. Cattle rustling's a serious charge in this part of the world, the kind that usually ends with a rope and a tall tree, assuming the rustler lives long enough to see a trial." Snake's face darkened, but he kept his voice level. That Mexican's old and half-blind, probably saw shadows moving in the moonlight and let his imagination fill in the details. I've been in town 3 days, Sheriff, staying at the hotel, paying my bills, minding my own business. Ask anyone. McCallister considered this for a moment, then walked over to where Big Sal stood, bleeding from a cut on his forehead. Sal, you see these boys doing anything besides drinking and playing cards since they've been in town? The bartender wiped blood from his face with a bar towel before answering. Can't say I have, Sheriff. They've been quiet enough for the most part. Course, quiet don't necessarily mean innocent. No, McCallister agreed. It surely doesn't. But neither does loud mean guilty. He turned back to address the entire room. Now, I could arrest the lot of you for disturbing the peace, destruction of property, assault with deadly weapons, and probably 6 other charges. Fill up my jail so tight you'd have to take turns lying down, but that doesn't really solve anybody's problems, does it? The men in the saloon exchanged uncertain glances, unsure where the sheriff was heading with his reasoning, but afraid to interrupt or challenge him. Instead, McCallister continued, his voice taking on a tone of quiet authority that brooked no argument. Here's what's going to happen. Snake, you and your boys are going to help rebuild what got broken here tonight. Your time, your money, your sweat. Every table, every chair, every bottle that got smashed in this little disagreement of yours. He paused, letting his words sink in before continuing. Tommy, you're going to file a proper complaint about your missing cattle, not accusations shouted across a saloon after you've been drinking, but a real complaint with dates, descriptions, locations, and anything else that might help me investigate this matter according to the law. The sheriff moved to stand directly between Snake Carter and Tommy Jenkins, his presence serving as both a physical and symbolic barrier between the two antagonists. And all of you, every last man in this room, are going to remember that Dust Valley is a civilized town with civilized laws, enforced by a civilized sheriff who'd much rather spend his evenings having dinner with his wife than cleaning up after grown men who can't settle their differences without destroying other people's property. Old Pete Morrison, still clutching his broken chair leg like a war trophy, cleared his throat nervously. Sheriff, what about my piano? That instrument's been with me for near 20 years, followed me from Dodge City to Tombstone to here. McCallister's stern expression softened almost imperceptibly as he regarded the elderly musician. Pete was something of a town institution, a harmless old-timer whose music had brightened countless evenings for cowboys and townsfolk alike. The piano wasn't just an instrument to Pete. It was his livelihood, his companion, and probably his closest friend. Your piano will be fixed too, Pete, the sheriff said with genuine warmth. Can't have a proper saloon without music. I'll make sure these boys understand that replacing your piano is part of making things right. A murmur of agreement rippled through the room, the first sound of anything approaching camaraderie since the fight had begun. Even some of Snake's crew nodded their understanding, recognizing that the old pianist was an innocent victim of their violence. Now then, McCallister said, his voice resuming its tone of final authority, I suggest you all start cleaning up this mess. Sal, I reckon you could use some help getting your establishment back in order. And gentlemen, I want you to remember something important. Men who'd been trying to kill each other earlier were now sharing drinks, swapping stories, and discovering unexpected common ground. Jake Morrison found himself in conversation with Mexican Joe about cattle driving techniques. Cookie Williams and Dynamite Dan were comparing notes on the relative merits of different brands of whiskey. Even the two traveling salesmen from Kansas City, once they'd recovered from their shock, were regaling anyone who would listen with embellished accounts of their role in the great saloon brawl. You know what's funny? Tommy Jenkins said to Snake Carter as they shared a bottle at one of the repaired tables. I came in here tonight ready to call you out, maybe even kill you if it came to that. Now I'm sitting here having a drink with you like we're old friends. Snake smiled. a genuine expression that transformed his usually harsh features. "That's the thing about fighting, boy. Sometimes the best thing that can come out of it is realizing you didn't need to fight in the first place." As the clock on the wall chimed midnight, the men in the Golden Spurs began to disperse, drifting out into the warm night air with handshakes, promises to help with the continuing repairs, and invitations to future, hopefully more peaceful gatherings. The great saloon brawl of Dust Valley was over, but the memory of how it had ended would linger much longer than the bruises and cuts. Tommy Jenkins was among the last to leave, partly because his injuries made movement painful, and partly because he was reluctant to end what had turned into one of the most educational evenings of his young life. As he prepared to head home to his ranch, he found himself thinking about Sheriff McCallister's words regarding violence and strength. "Snake," he said as the gunslinger prepared to return to his hotel room. "Can I ask you something?" "Shoot, boy. You've got a reputation as one of the fastest guns in the territory. You could have killed me tonight, probably could have killed of the men in here. Why didn't you?" Snake considered the question seriously before answering. "Because killing's easy. Just like the sheriff said, any man can pull a trigger if he's angry enough or scared enough. But living with what comes after, that's the hard part. Every man I've killed is still with me, boy. They ride with me every day, sleep in my bedroll every night." He paused, looking out through the saloon doors at the quiet street beyond. "Maybe it's time I started collecting some different kinds of memories." With that philosophical observation, Snake Carter tipped his hat to Tommy Jenkins and walked out into the night, leaving the young rancher to ponder the unexpected wisdom he'd discovered in the most unlikely of teachers. Big Sal was the last man standing in his establishment, surveying the damage and the repairs with the satisfaction of a job well done. The Golden Spurs wasn't quite back to its former glory, but it was functional, and more importantly, it felt like a place where neighbors could gather again, rather than a battlefield where enemies came to settle scores. As he locked up for the night, Sal found himself thinking about Sheriff McCallister and the quiet miracle the lawman had performed. Without firing a shot, without making arrests, without even raising his voice, McCallister had not only stopped a potentially deadly brawl, but had somehow transformed it into something approaching a community-building experience. Outside, the streets of Dust Valley were quiet under a canopy of desert stars. In houses throughout the town, families slept peacefully, unaware of how close their community had come to the kind of violence that could tear a frontier town apart. Thanks to one man's wisdom and courage, they would wake up tomorrow to the same peaceful community they'd known before, perhaps even a stronger one. Sheriff John McCallister sat on the front porch of his modest home, sharing a late-night cup of coffee with his wife Martha and recounting the evening's events. She listened with the patient attention of a woman who'd been married to a lawman for 25 years and understood both the dangers and the rewards of his chosen profession. "You think you prevented a war tonight, John?" she asked when he'd finished his story. McCallister considered the question while sipping his coffee and watching the stars wheel slowly overhead. "Maybe not a war, but certainly a lot of unnecessary bloodshed. Sometimes the best way to fight violence is to remind people that they're better than their worst impulses. And you think it will stick, this lesson you taught them? For some of them, probably. Others might need a reminder now and then, but that's why they pay me to wear this badge, to be here when reminders are needed." Martha smiled and reached over to squeeze her husband's hand. "I'm proud of you, John McCallister, not because you're fast with a gun or brave in a fight, but because you understand that true strength comes from knowing when not to use your weapons." As the night deepened and the town settled into peaceful slumber, the events at the Golden Spurs Saloon began to pass into local legend. In the days and weeks that followed, the story would be told and retold, each version adding new details and embellishments. until the night when Sheriff McCallister walked into the saloon became one of those tales that defined not just a moment in time, but the character of an entire community. The investigation into Tommy Jenkins' missing cattle would reveal that the real rustlers were a gang operating out of the Badlands, men who'd been using Snake Carter's presence in town as cover for their activities. Snake and his crew would indeed move on to California as planned, but not before helping to track down the actual thieves and recover most of Tommy's stolen livestock. Old Pete's piano would be restored to its former glory by a craftsman brought in from Santa Fe, paid for by contributions from every man who'd participated in the brawl. The instrument's sweet music would once again fill the Golden Spurs, but now it would carry with it the memory of the night when enemies became neighbors and violence gave way to understanding, and Sheriff John McCallister would continue to walk the dusty streets of Dust Valley with the quiet confidence of a man who understood that the most important battles were often won without firing a shot, and that the strongest peace was built not on the fear of consequences, but on the hope of something better. The night when the sheriff walked into the saloon would be remembered as more than just the end of a fight. It would be remembered as the moment when Dust Valley truly became a community, bound together not by fear or necessity, but by the shared recognition that civilization wasn't something imposed from outside, but something that grew from within when good people chose to do the right thing, even when doing the wrong thing would have been easier. In the annals of frontier justice, there would be many stories of dramatic shootouts, daring rescues, and last-second saves. But perhaps none would be more important than the quiet tale of one man who ended a war simply by walking into a room and reminding everyone present that they were capable of being better than their anger, stronger than their fear, and more civilized than their circumstances might suggest. That more than any display of marksmanship or courage under fire was the true measure of Sheriff John McCallister and the legacy he left in the dusty streets of a small town where the sunset never failed to paint the sky in shades of gold and promise. He paused, making eye contact with each man in turn, his steel-gray gaze lingering long enough to ensure his message was received and understood. "Violence is easy," the sheriff continued. "Any fool with fists or a gun can start a fight. Takes no skill, no intelligence, no character, but ending violence, preventing it, finding better ways to solve problems. That takes real strength, the kind of strength that builds communities instead of tearing them down." Snake Carter, who'd killed men for lesser insults than being called a fool, found himself nodding along with the sheriff's words instead of reaching for his guns. There was something about McCallister's delivery that made even hard-case outlaws stop and think about their choices. "Miguel Esperanza," McCallister said suddenly, causing Tommy Jenkins to look up in surprise. "You mentioned he saw something. Miguel's been working cattle in this territory for 40 years. His eyes might not be what they once were, but his words, always been good. I'll be riding out to talk with him tomorrow morning." Tommy felt a surge of hope. At least someone was taking his accusations seriously, treating them as a matter for investigation rather than dismissing them outright. "And Snake," the sheriff continued, "I'll be keeping an eye on your activities while you're in my town. Nothing personal, you understand. Just good business practice when dealing with men who carry the kind of reputation you've earned." Snake's jaw tightened, but he nodded curtly. He'd dealt with lawmen before, some corrupt, some incompetent, and a few who were genuinely dangerous. McCallister fell into that last category, the kind of sheriff who couldn't be bought, intimidated, or fooled. "Fair enough, Sheriff," Snake replied. "We'll be moving on in a few days anyway, just passing through on our way to California." "I'm sure you are," McCallister said neutrally. "Until then, I trust we understand each other." With that, the sheriff touched the brim of his hat in a gesture that was part farewell and part reminder of his authority. He turned and began walking toward the saloon doors, his boots clicking against the wooden floor with the same measured pace that had announced his arrival. As he reached the Batwing doors, McCallister paused and looked back, over his shoulder. The gesture was casual, almost an afterthought, but it carried the weight of a final warning. Oh, and boys, next time you feel the urge to settle your differences with violence, remember this moment. Remember how it felt when the shooting stopped, and you had to look around at the damage you'd caused. Ask yourselves if whatever you were fighting about was really worth all this destruction. His gaze swept the room one final time, taking in the overturned furniture, the broken glass, the blood-stained sawdust, and the faces of men who were slowly beginning to comprehend the full extent of what had just transpired. A man's reputation isn't built on how many fights he can win, McCallister said quietly. It's built on how many fights he can avoid. Think about that the next time someone says something that makes your blood run hot. Then he was gone, pushing through the Batwing doors and disappearing into the warm night air, leaving behind a room full of chastened men and the lingering sense that they'd all just witnessed something remarkable. Not a display of force or violence, but something far more powerful, the quiet authority of a man who understood that true strength didn't come from the gun on his hip, but from the respect he'd earned and the responsibility he carried. For a long moment after the sheriff's departure, nobody moved. The silence stretched uncomfortably as each man processed what had just happened and what it meant for their immediate future. Then Snake Carter, perhaps recognizing that resistance was futile and possibly even foolish, bent down and began picking up pieces of a broken chair. The simple action broke the spell that had held the room in frozen tableau. One by one, the other men began to move, some helping with the cleanup, others tending to their wounds, all of them operating under the unspoken understanding that the evening's violence was definitively over. Tommy Jenkins, his anger spent and his adrenaline fading, suddenly felt the full weight of exhaustion settling over him like a heavy blanket. The cut above his eye throbbed painfully, his ribs ached from the punches he'd absorbed, and his hands shook slightly as the reality of how close he'd come to death began to sink in. "Here, boy," Big Sal called out, extending a bottle of whiskey across the bar. "You look like you could use this more than I could sell it." Tommy accepted the bottle gratefully, taking a long pull of the amber liquid and feeling it burn away some of the pain and shock. Around him, former enemies were working side by side to restore order to the Golden Spurs, their earlier animosity replaced by the shared recognition that they'd all been participants in something that had gotten far out of hand. Mexican Joe and Cookie Williams found themselves working together to right an overturned table, their earlier combat forgotten in the face of the larger task at hand. Dynamite Dan was helping Pete Morrison gather up the scattered piano keys, handling the broken ivory pieces with surprising gentleness. Even Frank Kennedy, who'd been trying to gut Tommy with a knife just minutes earlier, offered the young rancher a relatively clean bar towel to press against his bleeding forehead. The gesture was made without words, but it carried the weight of an apology and possibly even the beginning of mutual respect. As the cleanup progressed, conversations began to spring up around the room, tentative at first, then gradually more. Relaxed as men discovered they had more in common than they'd realized. Cowboys shared stories with outlaws, townspeople found themselves laughing at jokes told by drifters, and the artificial barriers that had seemed so important just an hour earlier began to dissolve in the face of shared humanity. "You know," Jake Morrison said to no one in particular as he swept up broken glass, "Sheriff McCallister never even drew his gun. Just walked in here calm as Sunday morning and somehow made us all feel like schoolboys caught fighting in the churchyard. Cookie." Williams nodded thoughtfully. "That's the mark of a real lawman right there. Most badges I've known would have come in shooting, asked questions later if there was anybody left to answer them." Snake Carter, who'd been listening to the conversation while helping to repair a damaged table, looked up from his work. "McCallister's different," he admitted grudgingly. Got to respect a man who can end a fight without starting another one. It was perhaps the closest thing to a compliment that the notorious gunslinger had ever paid to a representative of law and order, and the men around him recognized the significance of the admission. As the evening wore on, the Golden Spurs Saloon began to take on something approaching its normal appearance. The larger pieces of furniture were righted and repaired as much as possible. The worst of the debris was cleared away, and Big Sal began the process of assessing what would need to be replaced entirely. Going to cost a pretty penny to get this place back to where it was, Sal observed, surveying the damage with a practiced eye. New tables, new chairs, new bottles, new mirror for behind the bar, and that's not even counting Pete's piano. Snake Carter reached into his pocket and withdrew a leather pouch heavy with silver coins. "How much?" he asked simply. Sal named a figure that made several men whistle in appreciation. It was enough money to keep a cowboy in beans and bullets for 6 months. Snake didn't hesitate, counting out the required amount and placing it on the bar. "That cover it?" he asked. "More than covers it," Sal admitted. "Probably enough left over to buy everyone a drink when we're back in business." "Then that's what we'll do," Snake decided. "Seems like the right thing after all this." Tommy Jenkins watched this exchange with something approaching amazement. The man he'd accused of cattle rustling just hours earlier was now paying to repair damage that hadn't been entirely his fault, showing a side of his character that didn't match his fearsome reputation. "Snake," Tommy said hesitantly, "I owe you an apology. I shouldn't have accused you without proof. Heat and worry made me say things I had no right to say." The gunslinger studied the young rancher for a moment before nodding slowly. "Takes courage. To admit when you're wrong, boy. More courage than it takes to start a fight anyway. As for your cattle problem, I hope the sheriff can help you sort it out." It wasn't exactly a declaration of innocence, but it was close enough to satisfy Tommy's sense of justice. The young man had learned something important about the difference between suspicion and proof, between anger and action. Old Pete Morrison had been examining his damaged piano with the careful attention of a doctor checking a patient's vital signs. Several keys were broken, the soundboard was cracked, and one of the legs was barely hanging on, but the basic structure seemed sound. "She'll play again," Pete announced to the room. "Might take some work, but she's got good bones. Like an old horse that's been through a few storms, but still has some run left in her." The announcement was greeted with a cheer from the assembled men, many of whom had grown fond of Pete's musical accompaniment to their evening drinking. The promise that the piano would be restored seemed to symbolize something larger. The idea that even serious damage could be repaired with effort and good intentions. As the night wore on and the immediate cleanup was completed, the atmosphere in the Golden Spurs began to take on an almost festive quality.